James Walker, the CEO of Walker Automotive, had spent years building his company into one of the most respected car dealerships in the region. From a single location, it had expanded across several cities, with a loyal customer base and a reputation for quality. But lately, something had been gnawing at him. Customer complaints were on the rise. A few had mentioned rude salespeople, while others spoke of unfair trade-ins and hidden fees. James had always prided himself on treating his customers right, but the complaints were growing louder, and they weren't matching the reports from his management team. Everything on paper looked fine. Sales were up, employee morale was high, and customer satisfaction scores were stable. But James wasn't convinced. He knew that numbers didn't always tell the full story, and he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that his company wasn't as ethical as it once had been. The thought that some of his employees might be taking advantage of customers weighed heavily on him. He wasn't sure how deep the issues went, but he couldn't sit back and let his company's values slip through the cracks. Something had to change, but he needed to see things for himself. That's when James made a bold decision. He would go undercover. Disguised as a regular customer, he would walk into one of his own dealerships and experience firsthand how his employees treated customers when they thought no one was watching. James wasn't sure what to expect, but he had a feeling that it wasn't going to be pleasant. With a simple baseball cap and a pair of dark sunglasses, he entered the dealership, making sure he blended into the crowd of ordinary customers. He wasn't looking for anything flashy, just another face among the crowd. He didn't want anyone to recognize him, and so far, his plan was working. The sales staff greeted him with the same enthusiasm they showed any potential customer. They assumed he was just another middle-aged man looking for a reasonable deal. James played his part, browsing through the cars, pretending to be interested in several models, while keeping a close eye on how the employees interacted with the other customers around him. As he wandered the showroom, he noticed the subtle things, the nervous glances exchanged between salespeople, the way some customers seemed uncomfortable or hesitant, and the hushed conversations that seemed to happen behind closed doors. He wasn't here to pick out a car. He was here to see if the ethical standards he had built his company on were still being upheld. Then, as he passed the trade-in desk, he overheard a conversation that immediately caught his attention. A woman's voice, trembling with emotion, carried across the showroom. James turned slightly, pretending to inspect a car, but his full attention was on the elderly couple standing at the counter. The man, an older gentleman with silver hair, was holding his wife's hand tightly, his face showing the strain of a difficult decision. Their car, an older model, was parked outside, looking out of place among the dealership's newer, more expensive vehicles. The salesman, Rick Larson, the dealership's manager, was speaking to them with a cold, dismissive tone, offering them far less than the car was worth. James felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to the elderly couple explain that the car belonged to their deceased son. It was all they had left of him, and they were reluctantly trading it in because they couldn't afford the repairs. The wife wiped her eyes, and the husband tried to stay strong, but it was clear that the decision was breaking them. Yet Rick remained unmoved, offering them a ridiculously low amount for the car and showing no empathy for their loss. "Sentimental value doesn't affect the appraisal," he said with a shrug, as if it was just another transaction. James could feel the anger rising inside him. This wasn't just a bad deal. It was exploitation, taking advantage of people at their most vulnerable. James knew he had to step in. But how? The situation felt almost too personal, too wrong to ignore. This wasn't just about business. It was about treating people with dignity and respect. James couldn't stand by and watch any longer. He stepped forward, clearing his throat as he approached the counter. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Rick turned to him, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, this is a private discussion," Rick said curtly. James didn't flinch. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm actually in the market for a car myself, and that sedan caught my eye." The elderly couple looked at him in surprise, while Rick's expression darkened. "It's not for sale," Rick snapped, his tone dismissive. But James wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. "I might be interested in buying it directly," James said, trying to remain neutral. "What's the trade-in value?" Rick hesitated for a moment. $2,000, he said reluctantly. James raised an eyebrow, pretending to be surprised. "That's it for a car in this condition?" James, still playing his part, made his offer. $5,000, 0 cents. The room went silent, and the elderly couple gasped. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. The wife started to protest, but James raised his hand to reassure her. "Let's step outside," he said, gesturing for them to follow him. Away from Rick's prying eyes, James listened as the couple explained more about the car and their situation. It turned out their son had been a firefighter, and the car had been his pride and joy. After he passed away in the line of duty, they had kept the car as a memorial, but the financial strain of medical bills and aging had forced them to part with it. James nodded, understanding the depth of their attachment to the vehicle. "I'll buy the car from you," he said gently, "but not for trade-in. I don't want it to end up on a resale lot. I'll restore it and keep it in his memory." The elderly woman's eyes welled with tears, and the man squeezed James's hand in gratitude. They couldn't believe the kindness he was showing them. James took out his checkbook and handed them $5,000, 0 cents. As they walked away, James watched them with a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing he had done the right thing. But as the couple left, Rick stormed outside, his face flushed with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" Rick snapped, stepping in front of James. James turned to face him, his expression calm but unwavering. "Helping a customer," he said, his voice low. Rick's anger flared and he stepped closer. "That's not how it works here," he muttered. James didn't move. "It should be," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience in the business. "And that's why you're fired." As the realization set in, James handed Rick his business card, revealing his true identity. "I'm James Walker, the owner of Walker Automotive," he said sharply, "and I just watched you disrespect those customers, lie to them about their car's value, and act like this place is a scam operation. You're fired." Rick stood there, stunned, his mouth open as he processed the revelation. "You're fired," James repeated. "Get your things and leave." The tension in the air was palpable as Rick stormed out of the dealership, but James felt a sense of relief. He had made the first step in reclaiming the integrity of his company. It was time for a change, one that would put customers first, always. As James walked deeper into the Walker Automotive dealership, he allowed himself to take in the familiar sights: rows of shiny cars gleaming under the showroom lights, the polished floors reflecting every step, and the quiet hum of the air conditioning blending with the faint murmur of salespeople and customers. This was the business he had built from the ground up, and yet something felt off today. James was here undercover, as a regular customer, blending in with the crowd. He wasn't in a suit or a tie, but instead wore a simple button-up shirt and jeans. His goal wasn't to shop for a new car, but to observe, to witness how the dealership's sales tactics had evolved over the years. Within minutes of walking through the showroom, a young salesman, no older than 25, approached him. His smile was wide, his posture confident, and his voice polished, a clear indication that he had been trained to charm. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" he asked, his hands folded in front of him. James smiled back, playing his role. "I'm just browsing for now," he replied casually, scanning the cars on display. "I'm looking for something reliable, maybe a sedan, but nothing too fancy." The salesman nodded eagerly, ready to launch into his pitch. "Well, we have a few great options. Let me show you our most popular models," he said enthusiastically. James followed the salesman as they walked around the showroom. He wasn't paying much attention to the cars, instead focusing on the subtle details of the interaction. He observed how the salesman moved, how he made quick eye contact, how his hands gestured toward the vehicles with practiced precision, and how his voice seemed to rise and fall at just the right moments to emphasize the car's features. James also noticed how the salesman shifted his attention when a more affluent-looking couple walked past. He greeted them with an even wider smile, more personal than the one he had given James. This subtle difference in treatment didn't escape James, but he kept his thoughts to himself, not wanting to raise suspicion. As they continued through the showroom, James overheard snippets of conversation between the salespeople and other customers. It was the usual chatter about features, prices, and availability. But the more he listened, the more he began to notice a pattern. There was a sense of urgency in the way the salespeople spoke, pushing customers to make decisions quickly. Some customers seemed uncertain, as if they weren't entirely comfortable with the terms being presented. But the salespeople pressed on, guiding them towards signing agreements or committing to deals. The environment felt increasingly transactional. Sales were being made, yes, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was being overlooked. The customers' true needs, their financial situations, and their emotional connections to the cars they were buying or selling. And then James's attention was drawn to a particular interaction taking place at the trade-in desk. At first, he thought it was just another routine trade-in, but as he drew closer, he saw the elderly couple standing there. The woman was visibly distressed, her hands trembling as she clutched her husband's arm. Her face, creased with age, was a portrait of worry and fatigue. The man, though tall and still strong, had a look of quiet sorrow in his eyes. They were in their 70s, perhaps older, and from the way they were dressed it was clear that they weren't wealthy. Their clothes were modest, not flashy, and their demeanor spoke of a lifetime of hard work, not excess. The car they were trading in was an older model, well maintained but clearly not as new as the cars on display in the showroom. Behind the desk, a salesman named Rick Larson was handling the trade-in. His smile was tight, his body language stiff as he shuffled through the paperwork in front of him. James could hear the exchange from where he stood, just a few feet away. "I'm sorry, but this is the best I can do for you," Rick said, his voice almost mechanical. "Your car is over 10 years old, and it's got quite a bit of mileage on it. $2,000 is generous, considering its condition." The elderly woman's face crumpled in disappointment, and the man squeezed her hand tighter, as if trying to offer some comfort. "But this car was our son's," the woman said, her voice breaking slightly. "He passed away last year. We've kept it all this time, but we just can't afford to keep it any longer. It's the last thing we have of him." James' heart clenched as he heard the woman's words. The car was more than just a vehicle to them. It was a piece of their son's memory, something they had clung to after his untimely death. But Rick, the sales manager, didn't seem to care about any of that. He barely looked up from his paperwork as he shrugged. "I understand this is emotional for you," he said with a practiced sigh, "but sentimental value doesn't add dollars to an appraisal. The market price is the market price." James could see the woman's lip tremble as she wiped at her eyes. Her husband's face had turned pale, and his jaw was clenched tightly, as though trying to suppress the emotion that was threatening to overtake him. The conversation continued in this vein for several minutes, with Rick offering no empathy or flexibility. The elderly couple was clearly at their breaking point. James, watching this unfold before him, felt his anger growing. He had been part of this business for years, and he had never imagined it would become a place where customers were treated this way, especially not the elderly, who were vulnerable and often at the mercy of salespeople's tactics. James had seen this before, the coldness, the lack of compassion, but to see it happening in his own dealership, to a couple who had lost their son, was unacceptable. James couldn't stay silent any longer. He took a step forward, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. He cleared his throat and asked, "Excuse me, what's going on here?" Rick turned sharply, annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, this is a private discussion," he said, his tone dismissive. James didn't flinch. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm in the market for a car myself, and that sedan caught my eye." "What's the trade-in value on it?" Rick hesitated for a moment, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. $2,000, he replied, his tone flat. "It's an old car, with a lot of wear and tear." James raised an eyebrow, pretending to be surprised. $2,000 for a car in this condition? That doesn't seem right." The elderly couple looked at him, confused and hesitant, but grateful for the intervention. James knew he had to do something. He wasn't just going to let this car be sold for a pittance and end up on a resale lot where it would be lost to the family's memory. He turned to the elderly couple, his heart going out to them. "I'll buy the car from you," he said gently. "But not for the trade-in price. I don't want it to end up in the hands of someone else. I'll restore it and keep it in honor of your son." The couple was stunned. The woman's eyes welled with tears, and the man's hand gripped James's in silent gratitude. James reached into his pocket, pulling out a checkbook, and wrote them a check for $5,000, 0 cents. The woman shook her head in disbelief. "Why would you do this for us?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. James smiled softly, his voice steady. "Because some things are more important than money. This car means something to you, and it means something to me too." As the couple walked away, James handed them the check and watched them leave the dealership. Their shoulders a little lighter, their hearts a little more at peace. It wasn't just about the money. It was about doing what was right. But as the couple disappeared from view, Rick stormed out of the office, his face red with anger. James knew this wouldn't be the end of it, but for the moment, he had made a difference, and that was enough. James stood quietly at a distance, pretending to examine a nearby car as he listened to the conversation unfolding at the trade-in desk. The elderly couple, an older man and his wife, were speaking to Rick, the sales manager. The wife's voice trembled slightly as she explained that they were trying to sell their son's car. The husband, though clearly struggling, seemed to be holding back his emotions. James had already observed their worn clothes and their quiet demeanor. They didn't seem to be wealthy or eager to part with the car. It was clear from their faces that this was not just a financial transaction for them. It was something much more profound. The couple's son had passed away the previous year, and the car they were trying to sell had been his pride and joy. Their son had been a firefighter, a hero in their small town, and they had kept the car as a memorial to him. Every dent, every scratch on the car carried a story, and the car itself had become a symbol of their love and loss. But now, with mounting medical bills and their own health declining, they found themselves in a heartbreaking position. They simply couldn't afford to keep it any longer. They needed to sell it, but at what cost to their memories? The wife spoke again, her voice softer this time, almost pleading. "This car is the last piece of him we have left," she said, her voice wavering. "We've taken care of it for so long, but we just can't afford to keep it anymore. It's hard to let go, but we have no choice." Her eyes filled with unshed tears as she glanced at the car parked outside the dealership. A well-maintained but aging sedan. It was nothing like the shiny new cars on the lot, but to them, it was priceless. It was the last tangible connection they had to their son. James could feel the weight of their grief in the air. This wasn't just about money. This was about a lifetime of love, memories, and loss. Rick, however, seemed completely unmoved. His expression was one of impatience, and his tone was as cold as the words he spoke. "I understand this is emotional for you," he said dismissively, "but sentimental value doesn't affect the car's market price. The market price is what it is. This car isn't worth much, especially with the mileage and wear it has." He shuffled some paperwork and then looked up at them with an almost bored expression. "The best I can do is $2,000, 0 cents. That's generous, considering the condition of the car." James felt his chest tighten as he watched the elderly couple's faces fall. The wife's lower lip quivered, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to maintain some composure. Her husband's grip on her hand tightened, but the look in his eyes betrayed how broken he was. This wasn't just about selling a car. This was about giving up something that had meant so much to them, a final piece of their son's legacy. Yet here they were, facing the harsh reality that the car, which had once been a symbol of pride and memory, was now being reduced to a mere transaction. The man's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, his words carrying the weight of a deep sorrow. "It's not just a car," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's all we have left of him. We've kept it for so long, trying to hold on to something that reminds us of him, but we just can't keep it anymore. Our son. He was everything to us." The woman nodded silently, her gaze fixed on the car outside. It was clear that they didn't want to let go, but they felt they had no choice. Every word they spoke was a reminder of the pain they were carrying, and James could see it. This wasn't just a business deal to them. It was the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in their lives. Rick, however, seemed entirely focused on the numbers. He gave a slight shrug as though the couple's emotional attachment to the car was irrelevant. "I understand it's hard," he said, "but at the end of the day, we're a business. We can't get emotional about things like this. If you're going to sell it, this is what I can offer. Take it or leave it." James' blood began to boil. This wasn't just bad business. It was heartless. The sales manager, in his pursuit of profit, was trampling on the memories of this couple's son. James had built this company on trust, integrity, and respect for people, not on exploiting them during their most vulnerable moments. He couldn't stand by any longer. As Rick turned to finalize the paperwork, James took a step forward, clearing his throat to get their attention. The elderly couple looked at him in surprise, but their faces were still marked by their grief. "Excuse me," James said, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Rick turned, clearly annoyed at the interruption, but James wasn't about to back down. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'm actually in the market for a car, and that sedan caught my eye," he said, pointing toward the car outside. The elderly couple's eyes widened in confusion, while Rick's gaze narrowed. James took a moment to consider the situation. He could feel the weight of the couple's loss, and he wasn't going to let them walk away from this dealership feeling even worse than they already did. He turned to the couple with a reassuring smile. "I might be interested in buying the car from you," he said gently, "but not for the trade-in value. I don't want it to end up in a resale lot. I'd like to buy it directly from you for $5,000. 0 cents. The elderly couple exchanged a look of disbelief. The wife gasped, while the husband's eyes filled with tears. "But we can't accept that," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "This is too much." James raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. "Let's step outside," he said softly. The couple followed him, and once they were out of earshot of Rick, James turned to them. "I understand how hard this is for you," he said, his voice sincere. "This car means more to you than any price tag. I don't want to take that away from you. I'll buy it, but I'll also make sure it's taken care of, restored to its full potential, and kept as a memory of your son." The couple stood there, stunned, as James pulled out his checkbook and wrote them a check for $5,000, 0 cents. They had no words, only grateful smiles and teary eyes as they took the check from him. James watched them walk away, their spirits lifted just a little by the kindness he had shown. The weight in his chest slowly lifted, but he knew that this wasn't just about buying a car. This was about doing what was right, about showing compassion when it mattered most. He turned back toward the dealership, ready to face Rick and the rest of the employees. There was work to be done, but today at least, he had made a difference in the lives of this elderly couple, and that was a feeling he wouldn't forget. James stood silently at the edge of the showroom, his gaze fixed on the elderly couple at the trading desk. His heart ached as he listened to the conversation between Rick and the couple. It was clear that the couple was struggling not only with the loss of their son, but also with the painful decision to part with the car that had been a lasting reminder of him. The car was no ordinary vehicle to them. It was a connection to their son, who had died bravely while serving as a firefighter. It was their final piece of him, a symbol of their love and loss. Yet here they were, being offered a mere $2,000, 0 cents for it, a sum that felt like an insult to the memories they held dear. Rick, the sales manager, seemed indifferent to their situation, treating it as just another business transaction. He had no empathy, no understanding of the emotional weight the couple was carrying. The market price, in his mind, was the only thing that mattered. But James could see beyond the numbers. He knew that sometimes the value of something wasn't in what it could be sold for, but in what it meant to the people who owned it. James had been in this business long enough to recognize when something was wrong, and this felt wrong. This wasn't just about money. This was about dignity, respect, and doing the right thing. Without thinking twice, James made a decision. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, interrupting Rick's cold, mechanical words. "Excuse me," James said, his voice calm but firm. The elderly couple turned to him, surprised, and even Rick looked up, his eyebrows furrowed in irritation. James kept his composure, his eyes locking with the couples as he addressed them directly. "I couldn't help overhearing," James said gently. "I'm actually in the market for a car, and that sedan outside caught my eye. It's in better condition than what you're being offered here." The elderly couple looked at him, confusion evident in their eyes. Rick, on the other hand, was less than pleased by the interruption. James didn't let Rick's annoyance sway him. He took another step forward, speaking with sincerity. "I know this is hard for you," James continued, his voice softening. "That car is more than just a car. It's a part of your son's legacy, and I would like to offer you something better than what's being offered here." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The elderly couple exchanged a glance, unsure of what to make of the situation. "I'll buy the car from you. Not for the trade-in price, but for $5,000, 0 cents. I won't sell it or put it back on the lot. I'll restore it, preserve it, and make sure it stays in your family's memory," James said with conviction. The elderly woman's eyes began to fill with tears, and her hand instinctively reached for her husband's. The man, though initially taken aback, looked at James with disbelief. "Why would you do this for us?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "You don't even know us." James smiled gently, his heart full of compassion. "Because sometimes it's not just about money," James replied. "This car meant something to you, and it means something to me too. Your son was a hero, and this car carries his legacy. It deserves more than just being sold for a low price. It deserves to be honored." The couple stood there in stunned silence, their eyes searching James's face as they tried to process his offer. James could see the couple's hesitation, their doubt, but he knew what they were feeling. They didn't want to accept charity, didn't want to feel like they were imposing on someone. "You don't have to take the offer," James said, sensing their reluctance. "But if you do, I will make sure that car is taken care of. I'll restore it as a tribute to your son's memory, and you'll know it will be in good hands." The couple exchanged another look, and this time, the weight of their decision seemed a little less heavy. They had been prepared to let go of something they loved deeply, but now, James was offering them a way to hold on to it, to preserve their son's memory in a way they hadn't imagined. With trembling hands, the elderly woman reached out and accepted the check that James had written for $5,000, 0 cents. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her husband nodded, his own eyes glistening with tears. "You've done something for us that no one else ever would. We thought we had to let go of everything, but you've given us hope." James could feel the gratitude pouring from them, and it made his heart swell. He had done the right thing, and he knew it. This wasn't just about buying a car. This was about restoring dignity, about showing that compassion could still exist in business. As the couple walked away, their spirits lifted. James couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The weight of the decision to help had been heavy, but the result was worth it. He watched as the couple slowly made their way out of the dealership, their hearts a little lighter, their steps a little steadier. James turned back to the showroom, but his mind kept returning to the couple and the impact his intervention had made. This was why he had gone undercover. To remind himself of the importance of integrity, to see firsthand how things had gone astray, and to make things right. As he watched the elderly couple leave, a quiet sense of satisfaction settled in. He had done more than just a business transaction. He had made a difference in their lives, and that was something he would carry with him long after they left. As the elderly couple made their way toward the door, their hands clasped tightly around the check James had written for them, James felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had done the right thing, not only in offering them a fair price for their son's car, but also in giving them a piece of their dignity back. He watched them leave the dealership, their spirits noticeably lighter than when they had arrived. However, the brief moment of peace was quickly shattered by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps echoing across the showroom floor. It was Rick Larson, the sales manager, and he was fuming. James turned to face him, sensing the storm brewing. Rick's face was flushed with anger, and his fists were clenched at his sides. He stormed up to James, his voice rising with each step. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Rick spat, his tone dripping with fury. You just cost us thousands of dollars, and you've completely undermined my authority in front of the entire staff." His eyes burned with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. James remained calm, not allowing the heat of the situation to get to him. He had seen this type of behavior before, someone who was more concerned with maintaining power and control than doing what was right. James didn't flinch. He stood tall, his voice steady and even. "Rick, I understand you're upset, but what just happened was not about undermining you. It was about doing the right thing. You offered that couple a paltry sum for a car that meant the world to them. It wasn't just about money. It was about their memories. But instead of showing them empathy, you took advantage of their vulnerability." Rick's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger, but James didn't back down. "You may have been doing things your way for a long time, but that stops today." Rick was visibly seething, his hands now trembling with frustration. "You don't know what you're talking about," he barked. "This is a business, James. It's all about profit. You can't just go around handing out money like that. If you let people walk all over us, we'll never make a profit. You can't run a dealership like that." James took a deep breath, refusing to let the sales manager's words provoke him. He had made his decision, and he wasn't going to let anyone shake his resolve. Slowly, James raised his hand, signaling for Rick to stop. He let the silence settle between them, feeling the tension in the air. When he spoke again, his voice was low but firm, carrying the weight of someone who had been in charge for far longer than Rick could understand. "Rick, what you fail to realize is that this business isn't just about profit. It's about trust, about treating people with dignity. You've been playing this game with customers for too long, squeezing every last penny out of them while showing no regard for their well-being. That stops now." The words hit Rick like a slap in the face, and for the first time, James saw doubt flicker in the sales manager's eyes. He had always prided himself on being the top salesman, closing deals with ruthless efficiency. But James wasn't going to let that kind of behavior continue in his company. "I built this dealership on the idea that we treat people right," James continued. "Not only do we give our customers fair prices, but we also respect them. You may think you're helping the business by focusing solely on the bottom line, but that kind of thinking is outdated. If we don't treat our customers with the respect they deserve, they'll leave, and they'll take their business elsewhere." Rick opened his mouth to argue, but James cut him off, his voice growing more intense. "I'm the one who built this dealership. I'm the one who set the standards for how we treat our customers, and you've been ignoring those standards for far too long. Your tactics, your way of doing things, are the reason people feel like they're being taken advantage of. It's not the way we do business here anymore." Rick's face paled, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the weight of James's words was finally sinking in. James took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm making changes to how things operate here. You're fired, Rick. I'm done with your methods. From now on, the dealership will focus on fairness, transparency, and honesty. No more sneaky deals. No more exploiting customers. If you can't accept that, then this isn't the place for you." The words felt heavy, but James knew they were necessary. Rick had been toxic to the environment for far too long, and it was time to remove the rot before it spread any further. Rick stood frozen for a moment, his eyes wide with shock, trying to process the reality of what James had just said. Then, with a quick movement, Rick opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked as though he was about to argue, to throw one final tantrum, but James' gaze held him firmly in place. "Take your things and leave," James said quietly but with authority. "This conversation is over." For a moment, Rick stood there, a mix of disbelief and fury on his face, but then, with a defeated sigh, he turned on his heel and stormed off toward the back office. James watched him go, his stomach tightening as he thought about the difficult but necessary change he had just initiated. But deep down, he knew it was the right decision. He wasn't going to let Rick's predatory tactics define the future of his dealership. As James turned back to face the employees who had been quietly watching the confrontation, he knew that the real work was just beginning. The atmosphere in the showroom had shifted. There was an air of uncertainty, but also a sense of anticipation. James took a deep breath, walking toward the gathered staff. I want you all to understand that what happened today is a turning point. This company is about to change for the better, and I expect every one of you to be a part of that change. We're going to run this place with integrity, and we're going to show our customers the respect they deserve. No exceptions. The employees looked at him, some with skepticism, others with hope, and James knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But as he stood there, watching Rick walk out of the dealership for the last time, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was just the beginning of a new chapter. The tension in the dealership was palpable. After his confrontation with Rick, James had made it clear to the staff that changes were coming, but he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. It was time for a deeper reckoning. As he looked around the showroom, he saw a mix of nervous glances, awkward shifts of posture, and sidelong looks between employees. It was as though everyone was waiting for something to happen, but weren't sure what that something would be. James knew it was time to have a frank discussion with the team. It was time to confront the reality of the business practices that had been running unchecked for far too long. James gathered all the employees in the lounge, his expression calm but determined. The room filled with murmurs as people took their seats, the weight of the moment settling over them. As the last few employees trickled in, James stood up at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the people who had been a part of his company for years. "I've been watching things closely for the past few weeks," James began, his voice steady but firm. "And what I've seen, what I've heard, is unacceptable. There's a culture here that's been allowed to thrive, and it's not one I'm willing to let continue." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. "You've been instructed to lowball trade-ins, to offer customers prices far lower than they deserve, and you've been pressured into pushing high interest rates on people who don't know any better, especially older customers or those who appear to be financially vulnerable." The words were sharp, and James could feel the tension in the room rise as the staff began to look at each other uncomfortably. The truth was now out in the open, and the reality of what had been happening for too long had finally come to light. James continued, his gaze steady and unwavering. "This is not how we do business. It's not who we are. We are not in the business of exploiting people, of tricking them into deals that leave them worse off. We're here to build relationships, to provide value, and to make sure that every customer walks away feeling like they've been treated fairly and with respect. That's the standard I expect from each and every one of you." The employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between each other. James could see the discomfort on their faces, but he wasn't about to let them off the hook. This needed to be addressed head-on. It was then that Tom, a young salesman who had been with the company for a few years, spoke up. His voice was quiet at first, but it carried the weight of years of frustration and guilt. "James, I don't know how to say this," Tom began, his voice cracking slightly, "but everything you're saying is true. We've all been following the instructions we were given, but it's been hard. It's not just the trade-ins or the high interest rates, it's everything. We've been told to pressure customers, to act like we're doing them a favor, when we're really just looking to make the sale, no matter the cost to them." His words hung in the air, and for a moment there was a heavy silence. "I've been doing it too," Tom continued, his eyes now downcast, shame evident in his voice. "We were told that if we didn't do these things, if we didn't push the deals, we'd lose our jobs. There were times when I felt like I had no choice. I'm sorry." His words were a confession, and James could see the weight that had been lifted off Tom's shoulders. For the first time, someone had admitted what they had all been avoiding. The reality was that they had all been complicit in these unethical practices, either by participating or by remaining silent. But Tom's courage to speak out sparked something in the room. James nodded slowly, his heart heavy with the realization that things had gotten so bad. "Thank you, Tom, for being honest," James said quietly, his voice filled with empathy. "I know it's not easy to admit when you've been part of something that's wrong, but what matters now is what we do next." James paused, letting his words sink in. "The reason this dealership has thrived in the past is because of its reputation for quality and fairness, and that's what I'm committed to rebuilding. But I can't do that if the practices that have poisoned this company continue. I'm not going to let that happen. James turned his gaze to the rest of the staff. From now on, there will be no more lowballing trade-ins. We will offer customers fair prices based on the true value of their cars, not based on how much we can get away with taking from them. And as for the financing, no more pushing high interest rates. We will offer competitive rates that are in line with industry standards, and we will never prey on customers who don't understand the terms. This is the new way we will operate, and I expect every single one of you to uphold these values. If you can't, then this is no longer the place for you. James turned his attention to John Larson, who had been sitting quietly at the back of the room, his face flushed with anger and discomfort. James's voice hardened as he addressed him directly. John, I've seen enough. Your methods have been unethical, and they've caused damage to this company. I gave you a chance to change, but you've refused to. So I'm making this decision now. You're fired. The room went silent, and James could feel the shock ripple through the employees. John stood up abruptly, his face contorted with disbelief. You can't do this, John exclaimed, his voice rising in anger. I've been here for years and I know what works. You'll ruin this place with your new way of doing business. But James wasn't swayed. I am the one who built this place, John, and I'm the one who's going to rebuild it. If you can't accept that, then there's nothing more to discuss. Take your things and leave. John stood there for a moment, clearly trying to process the reality of what was happening. Then, with a look of fury on his face, he turned and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. James took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the remaining employees. This is just the beginning, he said firmly. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but I believe we can turn this company around. We'll start fresh, with honesty and integrity as our foundation. I'm counting on all of you to help me make that happen. Together, we'll rebuild trust with our customers and create a workplace we can all be proud of. The employees looked at each other, a mixture of relief and uncertainty in their eyes, but James could see a flicker of hope. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to lead them through it. The air in the dealership was thick with anticipation, as employees gathered in the lounge for what James had promised would be a pivotal meeting. The recent events, Rick's firing, the revelations of unethical practices, and the profound conversation about the future of the dealership had shaken everyone to their core. Some employees were uncertain, unsure of what was coming next, while others were relieved, hoping for a fresh start. James stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression steady and resolute. Today he was going to lay out his vision for the future of Walker Automotive, a vision that would put fairness, transparency, and customer satisfaction at the center of everything they did. I want to start by saying thank you, James began, his voice calm but filled with purpose. Thank you for being here and for being part of this company. But I also want to be very clear. Things are going to change. I've seen the way this business has been run for too long, and I've seen the damage it's caused to both our customers and to the integrity of the company. We're not just selling cars, we're selling trust. And right now, that trust has been broken. But we can rebuild it. And we will. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. James took a deep breath before continuing, the room hanging on to every word. First and foremost, I am making it clear that we will no longer tolerate dishonest deals. No more lowballing trade-ins, no more pushing high interest rates. We are not here to take advantage of our customers, we're here to serve them. The days of squeezing every last dime out of a customer are over. From this point forward, our focus will be on providing fair deals, transparent pricing, and excellent service. Our goal isn't just to close a sale, it's to build relationships and ensure that every customer who walks through these doors leaves feeling respected, valued, and happy. He paused for a moment, allowing the gravity of the shift to settle over the team. There were mixed reactions. Some faces were skeptical, others cautious, and a few seemed relieved, but all were paying attention. James knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing the culture of a dealership that had thrived on aggressive sales tactics for years was going to take time, but he was committed. Secondly, he continued, We're going to change the way we compensate you. I know many of you have been driven by the need to meet sales quotas, to hit numbers no matter the cost. That's going to change." He could see the employees' eyebrows raise in surprise as they tried to process the words. "From now on, your commission will be based not on the volume of sales, but on customer satisfaction." That's right. Your success here will be measured by how well you serve the customers, how well you listen to their needs, and how well you build trust with them. If a customer leaves here happy, you'll be rewarded. If a customer feels taken advantage of, we all lose. This new system will encourage you to think long-term, to prioritize building relationships over making a quick sale. James could see the uncertainty on many of their faces, but he remained calm, standing by his decision. "I know this is a big change. For some of you, it might feel like a risk. You're used to the old way of doing things, where making a sale meant closing fast and moving on to the next. But that's not sustainable, and it's not the kind of business I want to run. We'll still have goals and targets, but these will be aligned with creating loyal, satisfied customers who trust us enough to return and recommend us to others." One of the younger salespeople, Chris, spoke up tentatively. "But James, what about the pressure to hit targets? What if we don't make as much as we used to with the old commission system?" His voice was filled with uncertainty, but also hope. James smiled reassuringly. "That's a valid concern, Chris, but I want you to trust me. This approach will lead to more sustainable success. You'll be earning based on the quality of your work, not just the quantity of your sales. As we build our reputation for fairness, we'll attract more customers, more referrals, and more long-term business. It's a win-win." The room remained silent for a moment as the employees digested the changes. James knew that this new direction would take time to adjust to, but he was firm in his belief that it was the right move. The old methods had created a culture of distrust and dishonesty, but now he was setting the stage for a future where integrity and customer satisfaction were at the forefront. "I understand that this may seem like a risk," James continued, "but sometimes the greatest risk is playing it safe and continuing to do things that we know are wrong. I'm asking you to trust me, and more importantly, I'm asking you to trust yourselves. We can rebuild this dealership together if we work with honesty, transparency, and a real commitment to our customers." As the meeting came to a close, James could see a shift in the room. Some employees were still uncertain, but there was a spark of hope in their eyes. They were beginning to realize that this change wasn't just about new policies. It was about rebuilding their reputation and regaining their pride in their work. For James, the most important thing was that they were beginning to believe in the new vision, and he knew that with time this new approach would take root. The road ahead would be challenging, but it would also be rewarding. Together, they could create a company that was known not just for selling cars, but for selling trust. As the employees filed out of the room, James felt a sense of purpose settle over him. He had made his decision, and he was prepared to lead his team through the difficult transition. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be bumps along the way, but he knew one thing for sure. This was the beginning of a new chapter for Walker Automotive, and it was a chapter that would be written with integrity. The dealership would no longer be defined by the quick sale. It would be defined by the relationships they built, the trust they earned, and the customers they made a difference for. This was the future James had always envisioned, and he was ready to make it a reality. In the days following the meeting where James had unveiled his new vision for Walker Automotive, he found himself buried in paperwork. The dealership's reputation had taken a hit over the years, and while the changes to the sales strategy were important, James knew that the first step in rebuilding trust was addressing the past. He needed to make things right with the customers who had been taken advantage of, the ones who had been misled or overcharged by the previous management. Sitting at his desk, he reviewed every customer complaint, every negative review, and every case of fraud or deception. It was a long list, each story more damning than the last. James knew he couldn't undo the damage in one day, but he could start by doing the right thing, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. As he read through the complaints, James felt a sense of responsibility wash over him. These weren't just names and numbers on a page. They were people who had trusted his dealership and had been let down. Some had been charged hidden fees for services they never agreed to. Others had been sold extended warranties or additional products under false pretenses. In a few cases, customers had been tricked into bad financing deals that they couldn't afford, and when they realized what had happened, it was too late. James knew that these weren't just bad sales tactics. They were violations of the trust that customers had placed in Walker Automotive. He couldn't change the past, but he could make sure that it didn't continue to haunt the company. Without hesitation, James made the decision to issue refunds to every customer who had been overcharged or misled. It was a bold move, one that would cost the dealership a significant amount of money up front, but James wasn't concerned about the short-term loss. What mattered was the long-term gain, rebuilding the dealership's reputation, showing customers that Walker Automotive stood by its word, and restoring the integrity that had been lost. He didn't just want to give back the money that was owed. He wanted to show these customers that they mattered, that their experience had been a mistake, and that he was committed to righting the wrongs that had been done. When the refund checks started going out, the response was overwhelming. Customers who had felt scammed, cheated, and ignored were suddenly receiving letters and checks from the dealership, apologizing for the past mistakes and offering compensation for the overcharges. Some customers were in disbelief, unable to comprehend that a business would go to such lengths to make things right. Others were moved to tears, their faith in the fairness of the world restored by a company that had admitted its mistakes and taken action to fix them. Word quickly spread. A few customers shared their stories on social media, and soon the story of Walker Automotive's customer service revamp became a topic of conversation in the local community. People who had never considered Walker Automotive before were now curious, eager to see if the company's commitment to fairness was genuine. As the weeks passed, the impact of the refunds and the public acknowledgement of past mistakes began to show results. Former customers who had sworn off the dealership returned, and new customers, drawn by the buzz of transparency and fairness, began walking through the doors. They were no longer coming for the lowest price or the quickest deal. They were coming for the trust. They were coming because they knew that Walker Automotive was no longer the place where customers were treated like numbers. It was becoming a place where people could count on receiving a fair deal, no matter what. And as more customers walked in, the employees began to see the fruits of James' decision to change the company. The shift was palpable. The sales floor, once filled with tension and the pressure to close deals at any cost, now felt more relaxed and welcoming. Employees, who had once been uncertain about the new direction, were now embracing the change. They were no longer just trying to meet quotas. They were focused on meeting the needs of the customers, building relationships, and offering genuine help. It wasn't easy for everyone to adjust, but the growing customer satisfaction was enough to convince even the most skeptical employees that this new approach was working. James was proud of the team, but he knew they still had a long way to go. Rebuilding a reputation took time, and this was just the beginning. In the meantime, the ripple effect of James' decision was growing. Local news outlets caught wind of the changes happening at Walker Automotive, and soon the dealership was being covered as a positive story of corporate responsibility. Interviews with satisfied customers were shared online, and testimonials from people who had received refunds were posted on social media. The dealership's newfound transparency was starting to attract a loyal following. People who had been burned by other businesses were now turning to Walker Automotive because they trusted that the company had their best interests at heart. As the word spread, James couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when his decision to do the right thing began to pay off. Walker Automotive's reputation was no longer defined by its past mistakes. It was being defined by its commitment to fairness, its willingness to admit when it had been wrong, and its dedication to putting customers first. James knew that there would be challenges ahead, but as he watched the dealership's transformation take shape, he felt confident that they were on the right path. Customers were coming back, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They were choosing Walker Automotive because they believed in the change they saw, and for James, that was the greatest victory of all. James had known that turning Walker Automotive into a company based on fairness and transparency would come with challenges, but he hadn't anticipated how quickly the competition would retaliate. Langford Motors, the largest competitor in the area, had been keeping an eye on the changes at Walker Automotive, and now they were ready to make their move. It started with the prices. Overnight, Langford Motors began undercutting Walker Automotive's prices on nearly every model. Where James had worked hard to offer fair, transparent pricing, Langford saw an opportunity to exploit the situation. They slashed their prices by thousands, offering deals that seemed too good to be true. James wasn't surprised. This was the same playbook Langford Motors had always followed. Aggressive price cuts to lure customers in, even if it meant sacrificing quality and service. But James had no intention of getting drawn into a price war. That's exactly what Langford was counting on, the hope that Walker Automotive would start lowering prices to compete, that the company would cave under the pressure to keep up. But James refused to engage in that kind of race to the bottom. It wasn't sustainable, and it wasn't the way he intended to run his business. Langford Motors might be able to lower their prices, but they couldn't match the level of integrity and transparency Walker Automotive was offering. Instead of lowering his prices, James decided to turn the tables. He knew Langford Motors' tactics all too well: cheap deals and bait-and-switch pricing, where customers thought they were getting a bargain only to be hit with hidden fees and high interest rates once they sat down to sign the paperwork. James wasn't going to let Langford steal his customers with deceptive practices. He wasn't going to play their game. Instead, he would expose it. He knew that the key to winning this battle wasn't through price cuts, it was through trust. Customers had come to Walker Automotive because they believed in fairness, and James was going to make sure they understood that Langford Motors didn't have the same values. James quickly gathered a team to begin investigating Langford Motors' sales practices. They called around, they visited the dealership, and they carefully reviewed customer contracts. What they found was exactly what James had suspected. Langford Motors had been hiding fees in their deals. Customers were being charged for extended warranties that they hadn't agreed to, and financing rates were being inflated to pad the dealership's profit margins. Some customers were being misled about the total cost of the vehicle, with extra charges added at the last minute, charges they were never told about up front. In other words, Langford Motors was doing exactly what James had vowed to stop at Walker Automotive, exploiting customers for profit. Armed with this evidence, James didn't hesitate. He made a decision to go public, to expose the truth about Langford Motors' deceptive tactics. It wasn't just about competing in the marketplace, it was about doing the right thing. He held a press conference, calling attention to the practices that Langford Motors had been engaging in. He didn't want to fight fire with fire. Instead, he wanted to show the public that there was a better way. He talked about how Walker Automotive had always been committed to transparent pricing, to fair trade-ins, and to offering financing terms that were honest and clear. And then, he laid out the evidence he had gathered. The hidden fees, the inflated interest rates, the misleading terms, everything was there for the public to see. The response was swift. News outlets picked up the story, and soon customers who had been duped by Langford Motors began to come forward. They shared their experiences of being misled, of signing contracts with fees they didn't understand, and of feeling like they had been taken advantage of. It didn't take long for the negative stories to start piling up, and the tide began to turn. Customers who had once flocked to Langford Motors because of their low prices were now reconsidering their choices. Word spread quickly about Langford's unethical practices, and James knew that this would be his opportunity to show that Walker Automotive was the better choice, not because of price, but because of integrity. As the spotlight turned on Langford Motors, James made sure that his team continued to focus on providing the best service possible. Walker Automotive's reputation for fairness began to shine even brighter. Customers who had once been skeptical of the changes James had made were now seeing the difference. They weren't just being sold a car, they were being treated with respect. They were being listened to, and they were getting fair deals. It wasn't about undercutting the competition. It was about building trust and creating loyal customers who knew they could rely on Walker Automotive for honesty and transparency. Langford Motors, on the other hand, found themselves on the defensive. As the public backlash grew, their sales began to decline. The customers who had been drawn in by the too good to be true prices began to feel burned by the hidden costs and deceptive contracts. They didn't want to feel tricked anymore. Langford Motors had been playing the same game for years, but now the game had changed. And James knew that, while it wasn't going to be easy, Walker Automotive was on the path to winning not just in terms of sales, but in terms of reputation. The battle was far from over, but James was ready. He wasn't going to let Langford Motors' deceitful tactics dictate the future of the car business. With every customer who walked through the doors of Walker Automotive, James was reminded why he had chosen to go down this path. It wasn't about competing with Langford Motors on price. It was about proving that doing the right thing was the best business strategy of all. And as word continued to spread about the changes he had made, James knew that the future of Walker Automotive had never looked brighter. As the weeks passed following the revelations about Langford Motors' deceptive practices, James felt a growing responsibility to not just defend Walker Automotive, but to stand up for the values that had always guided his company. The media had caught wind of the ongoing conflict between Walker Automotive and Langford Motors, and the stories about Langford's unethical tactics were starting to spread far and wide. But James knew that it wasn't enough to just sit back and let the stories unfold. He needed to take a stand, not only to protect his company, but to demonstrate to the public that doing the right thing was worth fighting for. The time had come to make a public statement, one that would solidify Walker Automotive's position as a business built on honesty and integrity. The press conference was set for a Tuesday morning, and the room was buzzing with excitement as local journalists and media outlets gathered to hear James speak. The news of Langford Motors' practices had already caused a stir, and now Walker Automotive was ready to set the record straight. As James walked to the podium, he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a business announcement. It was a declaration of everything his company stood for. He looked out over the sea of reporters, each eager to hear what he would say next. The cameras clicked on, and the room fell into a hushed silence as James cleared his throat and began to speak. "Good morning, and thank you all for coming today," James started, his voice steady and clear. "I've invited you here not just to talk about Walker Automotive, but to talk about what this company represents. The past few weeks have been challenging, but they've also been enlightening. As many of you know, we've been at the center of a discussion regarding the practices of our competitor, Langford Motors. And I stand before you today to make one thing very clear. Walker Automotive is committed to honesty, integrity, and treating our customers with the respect they deserve. We do not and will never engage in the deceptive practices that some businesses have come to rely on to make a quick profit." The room was still, and James could feel the weight of his words landing on every person in the audience. This wasn't just a defense of his company. It was a call for others to follow suit. "We've always prided ourselves on being a dealership that puts people before profits," James continued. "We believe in fair pricing, transparent contracts, and customer satisfaction. And while Langford Motors may have chosen a different path, we will continue to stand firm in our commitment to doing what's right. Our customers come first, and that's something we'll never compromise on." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The media was listening intently, and James could feel the momentum building. This was the turning point he had been waiting for. But then something unexpected happened. As James was about to wrap up his speech, a figure in the back of the room stood up. It was a familiar face. Tom, a former employee of Langford Motors who had been with the company for several years. Tom had reached out to James in private, but now he was stepping forward to speak publicly. His face was nervous, but his resolve was clear. "Excuse me, James," Tom said, his voice shaky but determined. "I have something to add. I worked for Langford Motors for a long time, and I've seen firsthand how the company operates. I can't stand by and let this go on any longer. I have proof of the unethical practices you've been talking about." There was a collective gasp in the room as Tom approached the podium, a stack of documents in his hands. The reporters leaned in, eager to hear what he had to say. James stepped aside, nodding at Tom to continue. "I have contracts, emails, and internal memos that show exactly what Langford Motors has been doing to mislead customers," Tom said, holding up the evidence for all to see. "From hidden fees on car loans to inflated interest rates, I've seen it all. I couldn't stay silent any longer. It's wrong, and I want to make sure that people know the truth." The room erupted in noise, and the journalists scrambled to take notes and snap photos. Tom's testimony was the bombshell that everyone had been waiting for. The proof was irrefutable. Langford Motors had been knowingly exploiting their customers, adding hidden fees to deals and misleading them about the true cost of the vehicles. Tom's brave decision to step forward not only validated everything James had said, but also made it impossible for Langford Motors to deny the accusations any longer. It was a game changer, and James could see the immediate impact on the room. The tide had officially turned. As the press conference continued, James felt a quiet sense of victory. This wasn't just a personal win for him. It was a win for every customer who had been treated unfairly by Langford Motors and other businesses like it. The public now had all the information they needed to see that Walker Automotive was a business they could trust. The media coverage exploded in the following days, with multiple news outlets picking up the story. The public was outraged by the deception, and Langford Motors' reputation quickly began to crumble. People began to flock to Walker Automotive, not because of the low prices, but because they knew they would be treated fairly. James watched as customers who had once turned to Langford Motors out of convenience or price started walking through the doors of Walker Automotive. They weren't just looking for a good deal, they were looking for something more: honesty. And Walker Automotive was ready to deliver. James knew this was the beginning of a new era for his dealership. With Langford's reputation in tatters and his own company's commitment to transparency solidified, James was confident that Walker Automotive's future had never been brighter. The press conference had been a turning point, and from here on out, the company would only continue to grow. Driven by the principles of fairness, trust, and unwavering commitment to doing the right thing, the transformation of Walker Automotive was undeniable. In the months following the press conference, where James had publicly defended his commitment to transparency and honesty, the dealership began to experience a remarkable resurgence. Customers who had once been skeptical of the changes were now walking through the doors, eager to experience the new business model for themselves. Word had spread quickly, and people were coming not just for good deals but for the trust that had been rebuilt. Sales began to climb steadily, and the positive reviews were pouring in from customers who had been treated with fairness, respect, and integrity. James watched with quiet satisfaction as the dealership's reputation soared, no longer just a place to buy a car, but a business that stood for something more. As the dealership flourished, so did the morale of the employees. James's commitment to integrity and customer service had created a ripple effect throughout the company. Former employees like Tom and Tim, who had once felt trapped by the pressure to meet quotas and close deals at any cost, found themselves thriving in the new environment. Tom, the young salesman who had first spoken out against the unethical practices at Langford Motors, was promoted to sales manager. His knowledge of customer needs, paired with his newfound passion for integrity, made him the perfect fit for the role. Tim, who had once been skeptical of the changes, soon became one of the dealership's top-performing salespeople. His shift in mindset, from focusing on sales numbers to focusing on customer satisfaction, was a direct reflection of the new values that James had instilled in the team. Tim's transformation was a testament to the power of trust and transparency in the workplace. James couldn't help but feel proud as he watched Tom and Tim rise within the company. The changes he had fought for were not just about the business itself. They were about giving people a chance to thrive, to feel valued, and to be part of something bigger than themselves. The new commission system, based on customer satisfaction rather than sales volume, was proving to be a game changer. Salespeople were no longer stressed by the pressure to make quick sales, but instead they were motivated by the opportunity to help customers find the right car and provide a positive, honest experience. The dealership's culture had shifted from one of competition to one of collaboration, where everyone worked together to ensure the success of the company and the satisfaction of its customers. Then, one sunny afternoon, something happened that reminded James just how far they had come. The elderly couple, Harold and Linda Carter, walked through the doors of Walker Automotive once again. They were the couple whose son's car James had bought and restored, and whose faith in the dealership had been restored in turn. Harold and Linda had returned not to buy another car, but to thank James for his kindness. When they approached James, their faces were filled with gratitude, their eyes bright with warmth. "James, we just wanted to come by and thank you again," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just buy our son's car. You gave us something we didn't think we'd ever have again. A sense of dignity and hope. You showed us that not all businesses are out to take advantage of people, and we'll never forget that." James was moved by their words, and for a moment he was at a loss for what to say. The Carters had become more than just customers to him. They had become a symbol of everything he was working to achieve. In that moment, as Harold and Linda expressed their heartfelt thanks, James realized something deeper. He had been focused on rebuilding the dealership's reputation, on regaining the trust of customers and employees alike. But what he had really done was create a legacy of honesty, respect, and compassion in an industry that had long been known for its cutthroat competition and questionable practices. And that, more than anything, was the true measure of success. Harold's voice broke through James's thoughts. "We've heard the buzz around town," he said with a smile. "People are talking about Walker Automotive, about how you're changing things, how you're doing business differently. We're proud of you, James. We knew we weren't the only ones you were trying to help. You're doing something important here, and it's making a difference." James smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey he had started was far from over, but in that moment he realized just how much progress had been made. The dealership was no longer defined by the mistakes of the past. It was now defined by the integrity it had worked so hard to build. As Harold and Linda left the dealership, their gratitude lingering in the air, James felt a deep sense of peace. This was the work he had set out to do. It wasn't just about selling cars. It was about changing the way people viewed business. It was about showing the world that a company could be successful without sacrificing its morals, its values, or its commitment to its customers. Walker Automotive had become a place where trust was earned, where every transaction was a step toward rebuilding a sense of community and respect. James knew that the road ahead would continue to be challenging. There would always be competitors trying to undercut prices or lure customers with empty promises. But as long as he stayed true to his principles, as long as he maintained the integrity that had become the backbone of Walker Automotive, he knew that his company would thrive. The foundation had been set. The future was bright. And more importantly, it was a future that would be built on a legacy of honesty, respect, and the unwavering belief that doing the right thing was always the best business strategy. If you're ready to dive deep into the stories that challenge the status quo, uncover hidden truths, and explore the real lives behind the headlines, then you've come to the right place. At Deep Inside HQ, we bring you thought-provoking, eye-opening content that pulls back the curtain on the world of business, leadership, and life's most fascinating stories. Don't miss out on the next big revelation. Hit that subscribe button. Join our community and stay tuned for more exclusive insights, powerful stories, and behind-the-scenes looks at the leaders who are reshaping industries. Subscribe now to Deep Inside HQ and never miss a moment of the truth behind the headlines.